Today, both are under attack. We meet at a time of turbulence for our world, for people and for human rights. First and foremost, conflicts are taking a terrible toll as parties to war trample on human rights and humanitarian law. At the local level and online, many communities are riven with violent rhetoric, discrimination and hate speech. Add to that an information war, a war on the poor and a war on nature. All these battles have one thing in common: they are a war on fundamental human rights. And in every case, the path to peace begins with full respect for all human rights, civil, cultural, economic, political and social, and without double standards. Because building a culture of human rights is building a world at peace. I commend the critical contributions of the Human Rights Council towards this goal through its mandates and mechanisms and the response to evolving situations. Excellencies, our world is becoming less safe by the day. After decades of stable power relations, we are transitioning into an era of multipolarity. And this creates new opportunities for leadership and justice on the international stage. But multipolarity without strong multilateral institutions is a recipe for chaos. As powers compete, tensions rise. The rule of law and rules of war are being undermined. From Ukraine to Sudan to Myanmar, the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Gaza, parties to conflict are turning a blind eye to international law, the Geneva Conventions and even the United Nations Charter. The Security Council is often deadlocked, unable to act on the most significant peace and security issues of our time. The Council's lack of unity on Russia's invasion of Ukraine and on Israel's military operations in Gaza following the horrific terror attacks by Hamas on 7 October has severely, perhaps fatally, undermined its authority. The Council needs serious reform to its composition and working methods. Nothing can justify humans' deliberate killing, injuring, torturing and kidnapping of civilians, the use of sexual violence and the indiscriminate launching of rockets towards Israel. But nothing justifies the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. I invoked Article 99 for the first time in my mandate to put the greatest possible pressure on the Council to do everything in its power to end the bloodshed in Gaza and prevent escalation. But it was not enough. International humanitarian law remains under attack. Tens of thousands of civilians, including women and children, have been killed in Gaza. Humanitarian aid is still completely insufficient. Rafah is the core of the humanitarian aid operation, and UNRWA is the backbone of that effort. An all-out Israeli offensive on the city would not only be terrifying for more than 1 million Palestinian civilians sheltering there, it would put the final nail in the coffin of our aid programs. I repeat my call for a humanitarian ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Excellencies, around the world violence is increasing and conflict-related human rights violations are spreading. International human rights and humanitarian law are clear. All parties must distinguish between civilians and combatants at all times. Attacks on civilians or protected infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, are prohibited. Indiscriminate attacks are prohibited. Attacks where the likelihood of civilian death is disproportionate to the probable military advantage are prohibited. Forced displacement is prohibited. The taking and holding of hostages is prohibited. The use of civilian human shields is prohibited. Collective punishment is prohibited. The use of sexual violence as a weapon of war is prohibited. And violations by one party do not absolve the other from compliance. We cannot, we must not, become numb to appalling and repeated violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. All allegations of serious violations and abuses demand urgent investigation and accountability. And we are determined to take such action in relation to allegations against our own staff. Excellencies, the Geneva Conventions, which require the protection of civilians and the humane treatment of people in enemy hands, were not the result of an outbreak of global goodwill. These treaties were agreed because they protect everyone. Around the world, warring parties claim exemptions, asserting that certain people or situations are uniquely dangerous. But flouting international law only feeds insecurity and results in more bloodshed. Human rights conventions and humanitarian law are based on cold, hard reality. They recognize that terrorizing civilians and depriving them of food, water and health care is a recipe for endless anger, alienation, extremism and conflict. Today's warmongers cannot erase the clear lesson of the past. Protecting human rights protects us all. We urgently need a new commitment to all human rights, civil, cultural, economic, political and social, as they apply to peace and security, backed by serious efforts at implementation and accountability. And states have the primary responsibility to protect and promote human rights. To support states in meeting their obligations, I am launching a system-wide United Nations agenda for protection together with the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Under the agenda, the United Nations, across the full spectrum of our work, will act as one to prevent human rights violations and to identify and respond to them when they take place. That is the protection pledge of all United Nations bodies to do their utmost to protect people. Excellencies, around the world, governments must step up and commit to working for peace and security rooted in human rights. The Summit of the Future in September is our opportunity for such a recommitment. The new agenda for peace to be discussed at the summit applies a human rights lens to preventing and ending violence in all its forms. Building on our call to action for human rights, it urges an end to reflexive responses to violence, underscoring the need for strategic, comprehensive approaches that address root causes. Successful peace processes, from Colombia to Northern Ireland, demonstrate that the full spectrum of human rights is indispensable to building peace. The new agenda for peace recognises that security policies that ignore human rights can divide communities, exacerbate inequalities and drive people towards extremism. It calls for all military engagement to respect human rights and humanitarian law and to be backed by political and development strategies. It urges security policies centred on people with the full and equal participation of women and the strong representation of young people. It calls for human rights to be at the heart of the governance of new weapons technologies, including artificial intelligence, and seeks the total prohibition of lethal autonomous weapons with the power to kill without human involvement. It affirms that human rights and humanitarian law apply in cyberspace, and it calls for much closer cooperation between the UN's human rights frameworks, the Security Council and the Peacebuilding Commission to address violations and put human rights at the core of peace operations. Excellencies, the new agenda for peace also addresses the links between human rights violations and violence at community level. From the epidemic of violence against women and girls, to the activities of criminal gangs, to rising anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bigotry, the persecution of minority Christian communities and discrimination against minorities of all kinds, many people do not feel safe in their own communities. Media workers and human rights defenders are frequently targeted, sometimes as part of a strategy to reduce civic space and silence criticism. Decades of progress on women's and girls' rights are being challenged and rolled back, including their fundamental right to education and health care and their sexual and reproductive rights. The new agenda for peace urges governments to create space in national security policies for civil society, human rights defenders and those representing vulnerable and marginalised people. Freedom of the media, freedom of expression and an open, inclusive civic space are essential to peaceful democratic societies. It calls for the dismantling and transformation of power structures that discriminate against women and girls and for concrete steps to secure humans' full, equal and meaningful participation at all levels of decision-making on peace and security. And it presses for young people to be included as participants in decision-making on peace and security events. We are also setting our ways to tackle online abuses of human rights and support people's rights to connectivity and privacy online through our forthcoming Code of Conduct for Information Integrity and the Global Digital Compact. Peaceful communities require an open, secure, accessible digital public space that supports human rights and freedoms.
Excellencies, wars are not confined to the battlefield. Certain current economic policies at national and global level constitute a war on the poor and a war on their human rights. Numerous developing economies are still struggling to deal with the twin shock of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The SDGs are far from being achieved. This year alone, the poorest countries in the world must disburse more than $185 billion to service their debt, or more than their total public spending on healthcare, education and infrastructure. The absence of a safety net when it comes to debt jeopardizes the capacity of millions of people to enjoy their rights, their right to potable water, nutritional food, education, healthcare and work. The global financial architecture lies at the heart of this crisis in human rights. It is obsolete, dysfunctional and unjust, and must be reformed to provide long-term, low-cost financing and provide an effective safety net for all countries that need it. We call for the adoption of an SDG recovery plan at a level of $500 billion per year so that the developing countries can access affordable long-term financing. We also very much call for a new Bretton Woods to remodel the global financial architecture for it to reflect the world of today and not that of 80 years ago. The Summit of the Future will be an opportunity to envisage profound reforms to make the global financing frameworks more inclusive, equitable and just, so that it can help governments to prioritise social spending to sustainable development and to climate action, which is so crucial among human rights. The Global Social Summit and the International Conference on Financing for Development, which will take place next year, will place emphasis on how economic policies, including budgets, tax measures and subsidies, can enhance investment in the SDGs and in human rights for all, men and women alike. Excellencies, dear friends, our war on nature is a war against the human rights of the people who are among the most vulnerable in the world: indigenous peoples, rural communities, marginalised persons and the neediest. The crises afflicting our planet, including climate change, loss of diversity and pollution, carry within them the same profound injustice. It is the people who least contributed to these crises who are bearing the brunt and who are paying the highest price when it comes to aggravating hunger, famine, degradation of lands, of soil, forced displacement, contamination of water sources or premature death. Recognising the right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment by the Human Rights Council in 2021 and by the General Assembly in 2022 shows that the times are changing. Environmental justice, climate justice are rallying calls for ethical, equitable treatment for the principle of responsibility and of human rights. Climate justice means that the G20 countries should show the way when it comes to the progressive elimination of fossil fuels. It means that all nationally determined contributions or national climate plans should be adjusted to the maximum limit of 1.5 degrees for the warming of the planet. It calls for an effective carbon price and an end to subsidies given to fossil fuels. Climate justice calls on the developed countries to deliver on their financial commitments to the developing economies, starting with that commitment to mobilise $100 million per year and to double financing for adaptation between now and 2025. Finally, it means that the loss and damage fund should be made operational as soon as possible and should start receiving significant contributions. For many countries in the south, economic, environmental and climate justice are the main challenge of our times when it comes to human rights. The United Nations joins them in calling on all countries to shoulder their responsibilities. Excellencies, our world is changing at a dizzying speed. The multiplication of conflicts are leading to unprecedented suffering, but human rights are a constant. They give cohesion to our quest for solutions. They are fundamental for our hopes for a world in peace. 4 years ago, the United Nations celebrated its 75th anniversary by launching a global survey. The citizens of the whole world declared by a vast majority that they wanted global leaders to prioritise human rights and to respect them. This call was echoed during celebrations of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in December. This year, the Summit of the Future gives us an opportunity to respond to that call and to ensure that our global institutions should be in step with reality, which is constantly in constant flux today, and to fully adhere to the abiding values of human rights. Together, let us take this opportunity to further peace and human rights for everyone, women and men alike. I thank you.
Secrétaire général.